We're back to the Neil Haley Show. My guest today is Erin Macdonald. She's going to talk about Star Trek Prodigy. Erin, thanks for stopping by. And let's talk a little bit about your background before we get into Star Trek Prodigy.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
You're
I
welcome. You're
appreciate
welcome.
it. Yeah, so I've studied astrophysics. I have a PhD in general relativity and gravitational waves and for me I've always been a lover of TV and film, and so I have sort of found ways to integrate pop culture into science.
That's cool. And in that process, how did this whole thing with Star Trek Prodigy get started and stuff?
Yeah, so I used after I left academia, I started going to conventions to give science talks because I miss teaching so much and using pop culture to teach things like how artificial gravity in science fiction works or how faster than light travel works. And through those conventions, I met a lot of people in Hollywood and the industry who had friends working on shows, and this role of science advisor kind of came up for some projects here and there, and I moved out to Los Angeles. I started giving talks at the official Star Trek events, talking about the physics of Star Trek
Wow.
specifically. Yeah. And then I was hired for my first Star Trek science advising job was season 3 of Star Trek Discovery. And then they decided, we have all these other shows in production. Let's have a single point person kind of manage the technology and the science behind all of it. And so Prodigy is one of those shows, and I'm extremely proud of it.
That's really, really cool. And talk about becoming, are you a Trekkie yourself? Is that how it kind of the passion started?
Not from a young age, but I got into it when I was in college, when I was studying my physics degree. There were a lot of Star Trek fans in my class, as one can imagine, and so that's how I started watching it and fell in love. And Star Trek certainly got me through graduate school. I actually dedicated my dissertation to Captain Janeway as a thank you for keeping me going, because anytime I wanted to give up, I would watch Voyager, and she would inspire me to keep going. And so, yeah, I came into it later, but fell hard and fast for Star Trek.
How much do you look at your job specifically enough of looking at science, technology, and the future when it comes to the writing and the effects and everything in Star Trek?
Yeah, Star Trek has a, pretty strong legacy of its own technology that's been around and been grown since the 1960s. So keeping true to a lot of that, I would say the biggest challenge was on Star Trek Discovery when they flash forward to the future. So now not only are we in the 24th century, we're now in the 31st century. And so what does the future look like to the 24th century? And how do we kind of pivot from there? And so that's been a really fun challenge to try to see what that future technology looks like.
Oh, 100%, because the future technology is your biggest uh challenge, because how to define the future, the technology of Star Trek in the 60s. How
Mhm.
far ahead have we even caught up to any of it in our technology today?
I mean, we to some extent we have, right? And things like flip phones, right? They use the flip phone communicator thing, and those are a thing of the past now. And video conferencing, what we're doing, that was a technology in Star Trek that seemed far, far in the future. And even things, they had tricorders, the little scanning medical devices. Necessity is the mother of invention, and we've lived through a period where distanced medical assessments are becoming more important. And even just the technology of things like, wrist devices that are able to manage your heartbeat and everything, that's all kind of very future Star Trek like technology. And so there's some stuff that we're continuing to get towards, and then other things that unfortunately we'll probably never see, but we'll keep working on it and dreaming in the process.
So, let's talk AI for a second
Okay.
before we jump in, and then we'll get into Star Trek Prodigy. But it's really interesting to look at Star Trek in the 60s versus today, where there was definitely robotics. So there was AI as well in the 60s for the
Yeah, I mean, they had episodes called like The Ultimate Computer and things where we had evil computers that were running entire planet systems. And yeah, so Star Trek has always played with that technology. And then you flash forward to Next Generation and you have Data as an android and who is an artificial intelligence. And there's episodes like Measure of a Man that explore Data's autonomy as a artificial intelligence, and is he a human, and does he have choices, and what does that look like? And yeah, I think what is cool is as we have started to progress our machine learning technologies, we often refer back to Star Trek for guidance in how they talk about it and handle it.
So let's look at timelines now. This is always the interesting thing of timelines. In the 60s, what time in the future do you think it was in the 60s for Star Trek? And then you can kind of define all the way up to now Prodigy. And what years do you think it is? And if we were looking at us as a timeline for when that technology would be in place.
Yeah, it's the Star Trek is based on humans from Earth in the Milky Way galaxy as opposed to a galaxy far, far away. And so there is a straight line that's sort of drawn between who we are now and where we come to. And Star Trek has had time travel episodes where they go back to this era, or we have the Voyage Home film where they come back to the 80s and save the whales and all of that fun stuff. And
Oh
so
yeah, I remember that now in the movies. I saw more of the movies. I was more of a movie fan of Star Trek than the series.
Valid, that's totally fair, and in, Star Trek First Contact, where they come back in time to when the first warp drive is developed, and even in that lore, they talk about humanity going through World War III before they develop warp drive, and so, we've got some steps we gotta
Psi
go through
fact is
before we get
coming,
that
maybe. Oh
technology.
boy. Yeah.
Exactly. But I think that is cool, and I think that's fun that Star Trek plays with those timelines and shows that, we still are kind of on that track, and it sets an aspiration for us as well to reach for.
As a scientist, you see that as an aspiration, right? Space travel
Oh, absolutely. I think
and be it interspecies, not just the intergalactic species, not just okay, we're just going to be stuck in the on Earth forever. You have that.
yeah. I mean, what's cool is, and I think why Star Trek, captured imagination from the beginning as it did was because we are explorers at our heart and we want to go out to the final frontier and keep exploring space and to see what's out there. What I love about space, whether that's through research, through science fiction, through pop culture, whatever, is that it really does capture the imagination of all of humankind. We have a long ancient legacies of looking up at the stars and imagining what's out there, and so Star Trek tries to give a vision for us with that, but that's something that's always gonna inspire us.
It's always going to be the fun part, right? Okay. So now if
Exactly.
you go, so you're such a Star Trek expert. We're going to go all the way to Prodigy if in the timelines of history of Star Trek. First it's Star Trek, then go through it. I don't know it. So that's what I'm asking.
Okay. Well, so if yeah, so in terms of the shows coming out, in the order, we had the original series, then the Next Generation with Picard, and then we had Deep Space Nine and Voyager, and those were in the 90s. And then Star Trek Enterprise flashed back to old time before that kind of bridged our current space program with what would eventually be Starfleet. It talks about sort of the first voyages that humanity goes off on. So that was Enterprise in the early 2000s. And then a long drought of Star Trek. And we got in 2009, the films came out with Chris Pine, and they had, we call them the Kelvin timeline films because it was sort of a reboot of the Kirk era. And that captured a lot of Star Trek fans. And then Star Trek Discovery came out, which was set in the past, and then they flashed forward to the future. And then we've had, oh gosh, there's so many Star Trek now. We've had Lower Decks, we've had Picard, we've had Strange New Worlds. I already mentioned Discovery, Prodigy. Upcoming is the Section 31 film, and then we have Starfleet Academy, and they are all over the Star Trek timeline.
All right, you get your star. You know, you are the expert. Now, Prodigy, what type of timeline does that take place using the technology and everything that you want to make sure? Because any Trekkie spots something that's not up, like
Yeah,
technology wise, you're in trouble. So tell me,
right.
and we'll talk about the show.
Of course. So Prodigy takes place in the Star Trek timeline a little bit after Voyager. So this is sort of the Admiral Janeway concurrent with the Picard era. So It is kind of like a spiritual successor to Star Trek Voyager. A lot of those same characters are there, but we're focusing on kids who are discovering Starfleet for the very first time. So it's really seeing all of this universe through these eyes of someone who's never seen it before. So it's a great entry point into Star Trek, to be honest.
All right. And so let's talk about, without giving anything away, more the premise of the show and all the different things with Prodigy.
Yeah, it's it's an animated show. It's targeted a little towards kids, but I think it's for all ages, really. And the first couple episodes feel very Star Warsy, very Clone Wars, very action heavy. But then it quickly reminds you that no, we're in a Star Trek universe. So it's almost like Star Wars characters in Star Wars have discovered Starfleet, and now they're trying to find it. That's sort of the vibe of it. And, it's a bunch of kids who find a Starfleet ship that's been abandoned, and they escape their circumstances and start to learn about the ideals of the Federation and Starfleet and decide that they want to go there. They wanna go to Earth, and they wanna go and become Starfleet officers, and so we get to follow them on that journey.
Oh, no. So they're coming from the galaxy to Earth. That's
Yep,
interesting.
pretty much. Yep.
And
Yeah.
are you hoping a little bit of the academics goes into it for kids as well as, targeting more kids with the storylines?
For sure. I mean, as the science advisor, we're not only making sure that like the science they're talking about is correct, but also that we are introducing science in a way that's accessible for all ages. And so we have things like, they get caught in the gravity well of a red giant binary. And we explain that. And we have characters like Hologram Janeway, who's kind of a training mentor for the kids. And she's able to kind of be a proxy teacher to introduce these kids to these concepts. But that's a unique role of mine as the science advisor is to again, not just make sure the science is right, but that it's presented in a way that's consumable for all ages.
All right. And the importance of STEM and STEAM, right?
Exactly.
Are you consulting with other with districts and stuff, or the United States Department of Education when it comes to some of this?
I mean, I'm an educator at my heart, and so, teach and I've been a science communicator pretty much my entire professional life, and so reaching out to different age groups and different communities is incredibly important. What I love about Prodigy and that I think is unique when we talk about a STEM focused show for kids is that instead of painting a broad brush to say like, "Oh, we'll just get kids interested in science," we have specific characters who are on their own journey of discovering science. And so kids can see what that looks like on the path to becoming a scientist and realize that like you might like biology, you might not like chemistry, or you might love weather, you might be fascinated by the atmosphere but not really interested in dinosaurs. Like these are all different scientific fields, and I think what's great is that Prodigy demonstrates that for these kids.
Oh, absolutely. So, as a science advisor to the show, what do you go up and look at, and specifically viewing each episode before it's made, making sure it makes sense scientifically?
Yeah, the biggest role that I have, like ground zero point 0.1, if I don't do anything else, the main thing is to make sure that the dialogue is accurate, that we don't say anything wrong that contradicts current science. Everything on top of that is just icing. So if we have plots that are scientifically grounded, what can we do to play with that? I think a big part of my role is to build a scientific backbone for these stories that might not necessarily make it into the explanations in the episode, but when characters will give a single or 2 or 3 lines of dialogue to refer to it, it feels grounded. It feels like there's been some logic and thought put into it. And so that's kind of the space where I live in that role.
That's gonna be cool. And but what about, do you do any Trekkie advising too, to make sure that they stick with the Trekkie stuff?
Oh, yeah, of course. I have to know how warp drives work, how transporters work, how replicators work,
And if
all of
it's
our
any,
fun.
or else the Trekkies will come after you, right?
Oh, 100%. Yes, they will check everything, but it helps that I'm a fan myself, so
Well, I think you're more than a fan. You just nailed all this on the top of your head. You weren't looking at talking points. When are you writing a book about Star Trek? Is that coming?
Well, I did write a baby board book called Star Trek: My First Book of Space, which is out now. It is for 0 to 2-year-olds, and it's all about space, but there's a lot of Star Trek references for the adults in the family, so
That's
it's a pretty
great.
fun one.
Well, I mean, it's the perfect thing if you go to events, right? You have a
Yep.
perfect built-in audience. If you're going to write a book and you know you're going to be in, how many people come to these Star Trek events?
It's
Oh,
amazing how many people show up. I mean, it's thousands and thousands, but you would think that a pure science lecture at this event might not be that well attended, and it is out the door. People love Star Trek, and science fiction fans really are scientifically curious
yeah.
people and love the opportunity to meet a scientist. So I have a lot
Now,
of
I want you to go with the war, Star Wars versus Star Trek. I know
Okay.
I'm a huge Star Wars fan.
All
How
right.
much science is right in Star Wars?
Star Wars does not necessarily, try to be scientifically accurate, and I think that's fine. It
Do you
is a
think it could be
space
sci-fact at
fantasy.
one point instead of scientifically right? Could it be
Yeah,
sci-fact?
it's internally consistent. There are rules, and the one time Star Wars, I think, tried to introduce a scientific concept to the Force, which was the midichlorians, it didn't really go over very well, so it stays in the science fantasy world, but I love it. I have slightly more Star Trek tattoos than Star Wars tattoos, but it's more than 0, and I did get married in a Princess Leia dress, so
Okay, all right. I'm going to give you that. And I was Darth Vader in a ice bucket challenge. One of the my
nice.
TV station asked me to do that with the ice bucket challenge. You have to look it up, Darth Vader ice bucket challenge.
Love it.
But say I'm a legitimate 6'10", so I would have been perfect for a Darth Vader. I love Star Wars. I mean, I really would love to watch some of the Star Treks. It's just very interesting. I think that the you can grow into that. And if you look at my celebrity interview list, I have a lot of Star Trek stars that I've had on. I can't
Yeah.
tell them by the top of my head, but Google search Neil Haley and Star Trek and see which stuff's come up. And there is some pretty interesting names. I did interview the guy with that created the Klingon language.
Yeah, yeah, Mark Okrand.
Yeah,
Yeah, he's
he
great.
was on my show. So
I
yeah,
love it.
I see. I can't think of his name, and then you say, "Oh yeah, it comes to my head." I've done over 10,000 interviews, so you got to help me on that. I'm just
Oh,
great at
absolutely.
asking questions. So, where can people watch Prodigy? Where can they go?
It is on Netflix right now, seasons 1 and 2. Go watch it, go have your kids watch it. It's super fun. Like you said, I mean, for people who maybe haven't ever seen Star Trek but think they might be interested in it, when you're faced with 800 episodes starting in 1960s, it seems like a lot to watch. Start with Prodigy. It's a great entry point, and it's a really fun, sweet, wonderful show.
So, you're into all sci-fi or not?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Hardcore.
Everything?
All sci-fi.
Okay. Did you like Heroes? I was a big fan of
Mhm,
Heroes. I've
mhm.
interviewed a bunch of people in Heroes. I
Oh,
was,
nice, yeah.
are these, I heard a reboot was coming with that. Who knows? But see, there's a lot of interesting, they got to get content out there. And that's great that I'm going to tell you, if I would rank the best group right now, Netflix would be the one that's starting to really populate new content now for their viewers more than some of the other platforms. I think that they're at least I think, or I'm hoping we're getting more and more content after that strike. I'm sure that was killing you and it was driving you crazy too. So, best
Yeah.
is there a place people can find info on you, Erin?
Yeah, I can be found online mostly on Instagram at Dr. Erin Mac, DrErinMac, and I have a YouTube channel. If you look up Dr. Erin Explains the Universe, you can find links to some of my Star Trek science stuff that I've done for Paramount Plus, as well as my own episodes talking about the science and science fiction.
Well, congratulations to success. You're coming up with something that should make your passion and it's impressive. And think of more and more ways that you can monetize at those Trek conventions. And you never know what's next for you. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you so
Thanks,
much.
Aaron.
Yeah, have a
All
good
right.
one.
You're listening
Bye.
and watching the Neil Haley Show, and we'll be back in just a moment.